Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS for our Europe and Eurasia Studies. And I am delighted that you are all here on this very chilly morning. In fact, I was told as I was coming in, we must have planned the weather to give us a little Siberian cold to get us in our frame of mind as we discuss Russia today. I hate to boast, but I have to confess, this is going to be an exceptional day of discussion. We have brought together, I think, some of the foremost experts to help us understand Russia today and where it is going. We have drawn from Polish, Russian, French experts, American experts. So I have to tell you, I've been looking forward to this conversation for many, many months. But this conference, this gathering would not be possible were it not for the generosity and the great partnership of the Center for Polish and Russian Dialogue and Understanding, so ably led by its executive director, Dr. Sławomir Debski. Sławik has just been a terrific partner. We've actually held an annual conference for the past 3 years, and the reason that we held the conference was we were trying to understand the new dynamics in the region from Polish-Russian rapprochement. Of course, this year, our discussion is going to be very, very different. And I think we'll talk about how that will be very, very different. We're so delighted to invite a dear friend to me and to CSIS, Minister Daniel Rotfeld, former Polish foreign minister, who has the most interesting title of co-chair of Polish-Russian Group on Difficult Matters. I'd like to rename you. I would like to make your title the co-chair of the group on very difficult matters. I think we can add that. But again, to help and kick off our discussion, we're so grateful to Minister Rotfeld for helping us outline the incredible changes that have happened over the last 12 months. So let me just end here before I welcome Dr. Debski to the podium, that my hope for today is that we are able to deepen our understanding of what is occurring in Russia today and its impact on the region. We had an opening reception last night on Capitol Hill. Congressman Bill Keating gave some very impressive opening remarks, and then we had a keynote address by Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dr. Orzysko, and he challenged us. The minister challenged us by saying, "You do not understand Russia. We must," and think tanks, it was a clarion call for think tanks, that we have atrophied in some ways in our understanding of Russia. We must do better. And I want to tell the minister, I accept your challenge. We will deepen our understanding. But what I'm hoping we do today is not just talk about the issues. I would like us to start to begin to outline a transatlantic policy approach. We are so strategically confused that we have not even been able to define this new era. We're still calling it the post-Cold War because we have yet to articulate what this new era is. So I hope today we begin to provide that outline of a transatlantic policy approach. And again, I couldn't think of a better group of colleagues to come together to help us think through that new approach. So with that, welcome. We are delighted that you are here. And please join me in welcoming my colleague, Dr. Debski, to the podium.
Thank you very much, Heather. Good morning, everybody. I would like all of you to turn your chairs in the way you could follow the presentation on the screens, because I think it could be important for understanding the purpose of our conference today. A word about the institution. The Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding was established by the Act of Parliament to facilitate communication between Polish and Russian societies and to enhance understanding of Russia, contribute to the elaborating policy towards our biggest neighbor. Well, for last 25 years, we have wanted to believe the future of Europe is the continent, one, whole, and at peace. The idea serves as a magnet, or to be even more particular, as a light tower, navigating many in the West and in the East. Poland, without any doubt, is one of the beneficiaries of the peace in Europe. But also, Poland contributed well to the project of Europe One Whole and Peace, signing treaties of friendship and peaceful cooperation with all its neighbors, including Germany and post-Soviet Russia. Therefore, no one should be surprised that Poland, in particular, is very determined to defend the peace in Europe. Well, the recent events, Russia's annexation of Crimea, give a hint on Putin's real intentions. Now I'm going to show you a short movie, a kind of the political joke. It is the movie of Soviet times with my own subtitles, which are, of course, politically oriented, as all this event is very much politically oriented, or policy oriented, if you want. So the movie is about the question, what happened to Budapest Memorandum? As you all know, it is a kind of the international commitment. Ukraine was assured that in exchange of its nuclear potential would not be threatened by Russia by use of force, the threat of use of force, that the sovereignty of Ukraine will be guaranteed. So what happened to Budapest Memorandum? Show this movie, watch this movie.
Извините, сейчас, одну минуточку. Вы не можете его убить. Это хранится здесь. Я должен напомнить, я должен показать. Я вам предан всей душой, но я архивариус. У меня хранится документ, подписанный вами. Это чудесный документ. Возьмите документ. Там всякий, вызвавший вас в безопасности до боя, пишете вы и подтверждаете клятвы. Вот. Ну, слушайте, весь город должен помогать тому, кто вызовет вас, и никто не будет наказан. И это тоже подтверждается клятвой. Это подписано вами 327 лет тому назад. 12 февраля. 12 февраля.
Бабов всегда говорил, уничтожая силы.
Вами съеден исторический документ.
Yes. So it gave you a hint what may have happened to Budapest Memorandum and all other international documents, treaties. And without, and I don't know whether such a thing may have happened in the Kremlin, I wanted to believe that there was somebody, at least one individual, who tried to turn Putin's attention into Russia's international commitments. Nevertheless, Putin rejects the order established after the Cold War and wants to impose a new one, in which use of force and the threat of use of force become acceptable political equipment and everyday life reality. So the question to us, to all of us, is whether we'd like to live in such a world. What we are going to do with something happened with that. The question to us is how do we respond? How we should behave in such circumstances? What our reaction to Putin's actions should be? So that's why we decided to focus our conference on formulating new approach, new policy, foreign policy approach to Russia. And we couldn't dream about better speaker to introduce us to the subject than Professor Adam Daniel Rotfeld, Polish former foreign minister, but also member of various international bodies and institutions, including advisory group for Secretary General of NATO, contributing to various important international documents, last but not least, recent new NATO strategic documents. Without any delay, I would like to welcome and introduce to you Professor Adam Daniel Rotfeld.
Thank you very much for an invitation. And in fact, it is for me a problem because I noted that in this room, people are at least as competent as me, and it is like to bring, we are saying in Poland, to bring the wood to the forest or the water to the ocean. Nevertheless, since I accepted your invitation, I would like to share with you some comments about the present situation. I would like to say that the message presented by Vladimir Putin to the participants of the International Valdai Conference 2014 may be summarized in his words that Russia, I'm quoting, is not asking anyone for permission in its conduct of world affairs. Putin's speech, dubbed by the Russian media the new doctrine of the Russian foreign policy, is compared to the famous Churchill's speech and lectures given in Fulton and Zurich. According to one of the Russian commentators, it confirmed that the worst expectations. The original interpretation of the new Russian strategy may be brought down to a syllogism, as the old security system has worn out and is no longer binding, and a new one has not been agreed yet. Russia is free to determine what is lawful and what is not. The United States violated the rules of the game in Kosovo, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, so Russia is entitled to do the same in the case of Ukraine. There is no need to prove that this reasoning is to legitimize and justify Russia's right to lawlessness and to impose arbitrary rules. Such approach is accepted neither in the countries bordering with Russia, like the Baltic states and Ukraine, Poland, nor in the entire transatlantic community. I have in mind European Union and NATO. It does not mean that there are no rules and there are no voices that would rationalize and burden the Western community with the responsibility for the new assertive strategy adopted by the Russian leader. A theorist, one of the distinguished American realists, wrote in his analysis of international relations that the crisis in and around Ukraine is the responsibility of the West. To be exact, his words were the liberal delusions that provoked Putin. I would only like to note here and now that such a realistic reasoning is to explain ex post that the political decisions to expand NATO taken 20 years ago is the source of the current crisis. Michael McFaul and Steve Stestanovich are right by writing that this type of realpolitik is a policy prescription, as a policy prescription can be irrational and dangerous. There is just a need to become aware of what the security of the Central Europe and the entire democratic transatlantic community would look like now had the contemporary leaders of the Western world at the time lacked political wisdom, and had they followed the recommendations of one of the realists from Chicago and other scholars from many other centers who opposed in consistent way the NATO extension decisions. My first conclusion is there is no causal link between expanding NATO in the 90s and the annexation of Crimea and undeclared Russian military invasion in Ukraine 2 decades later in the second decade of the 21st century. Using such arguments by the state-controlled Russian media, television, and press does not mean that it was a crucial element of decision-making in the of the Russian leaders. The direct grounds for the Russian intervention was the escape of President Viktor Yanukovych and the charge of leaders and the change of leaders in Ukraine. Most important is another factor. The main cause of Russia's nervosity lies in the internal domestic situation in Russia and its future, in the internal situation in Russia and its failures to modernize the economy sector and the expected decrease of energy carrier prices, which constitute the main pillar of the Russian budget. The argument as if the Ukraine landed in the hands of fascists and followers and descendants of Stepan Bandera are equally untrue. Presidential and parliamentary elections verified that assumption. It is true that there are nationalist and neo-fascist movements in Ukraine, but their role in Ukrainian political life is rather marginal. The second conclusion is that the real cause of the Russian actions intended to destabilize Ukraine, to make it fragmented and subordinated and dependent on Russia, is the response and reaction to the pro-European program and political choice made by the Kiev government. The Ukrainian determination is to introduce reforms, to modernize and democratize the state. In other words, the Russian strategy is based on the fear that if the reforms in Ukraine do work, if, as in Georgia, corruption will be reduced and limited, and in-depth a genuine political transformation will commence, sooner or later, the peoples of Russia will also opt for such an orientation and direction of development. And the third conclusion, Russia's policy towards Ukraine is not a show of strength. In opposite, it is, in my view, a demonstration of weakness. The might and power of a great nation at the time of peace does not rely on its accelerated militarization program, but it does on the economic growth, modernization, and new technologies and innovations. Russia is well equipped to become a center of gravity for its neighbors if it takes advantage of its natural measures and intellectual potential in a rational way. However, Russia has made a different choice. It chose the strategy of rebuilding the empire and to maintain traditional concept of the zones of influence or privileged interest. Russia's policy towards the external world is based on weakening its surroundings and neighborhood, on destabilizing Ukraine, on the attempts to threaten and disintegrate the West. It consolidates its own security by upholding the myth and the myth of an eternal and external threat from the West. In reality, Russia's borders have never been as safe and secure as they are now. Actual threats appear at the southern Russian borders, not in the West. it is also the case of Tajikistan, where the Russian army stands guard. These and other new threats might and should be the subject of cooperative relation between Russia and the North Atlantic Treaty as far as Russia's security is concerned, pursuant to the catalogue of common threats of NATO and Russia drafted in Lisbon during the NATO Council Russia session in November 2010. That document has not lost any of the validity. The way back to cooperation in security is not locked. Now, I would like to say that the international security system in the transitory period is quite often characterized by uncertainty, instability, and certain level of imbalance. Hence, the political unpredictability, and it is the situation and conditions where old threats have not disappeared, but there are no new effective mechanisms and procedures of preventing and counteracting the new risks and challenges. These include the inspired secessions and rebellion wars that destabilize countries, weaken them, and allow for achieving political, economic, and military aims per procura without involving your own armed forces on the territory of a state against whom these measures are addressed. It requires undertaking action, not working on a new theory, and relevant decisions were made during the last Newport NATO summit. These decisions, however, were, in my view, too modest, too limited in their scope, and in general, too weak. The question is, what has to be done? The time is ripe to demonstrate some creativity about a new quality of relationship between NATO and the European Union. It is also connected with the need to increase military expenditures and to adapt the military budgets to new military threats. In practice, it will be possible if the internal resistance within the European Union states is overcome and if a decision is made on joint defense and security of NATO and the European Union countries in common. In this context, particular place and role in the defense alliance of the West has to be taken by the new relationship between Germany and the United States. Robert Zelig is right as he wrote, "It is time for both sides to launch a serious strategic dialogue about the changing world. Germany still lives on a frontier, but not of contesting armies. It is now on the frontier of contending ideas. Strategic vision must be connected to public support. Perhaps German sensitivities to the past, combined with an American focus on the future, can forge a wise partnership for another generation." End of quotation. I would like to say that there are different groups, as it was mentioned by Dr. Dembski, in international and national groups who are dealing with the problem how to elaborate a new action plan for formulating the new type of strategy with Russia. And one of them is the task force on cooperation in Greater Europe, and it was reflected in the report drafted by the European Leadership Network in July 2014 on crisis management, and stated that the existing instruments of emergency responses between NATO and Russia and between European Union and Russia are inadequate to the new challenges. In reality, European Union and Russia have no commonly agreed procedures to prevent and resolve crises. These recommendations, in my view, as they were prepared and published in July, they are not very innovative and rather modest, as their authors were not only Western experts, but also representative of the moderate, semi-official political analysts from Russia that have no deciding voice in Russian establishment in the decision-making process. The most recent European Leadership Network report of the 10th November, 4 days ago, contains the following recommendations. First, that the Russian leadership should urgently reevaluate the cost and risks of continuing its more assertive military posture, and Western diplomacy should be aimed at persuading Russia to move in this direction in its own as well as everyone else's national security interest. Second, that all sides should exercise military and political restraint, and political leaders should review their military rules of engagement to ensure restraint at all levels of command and to reduce any potential for an actual exchange of fire. Finally, all sides must improve military-to-military communication and transparency to increase stability and predictability by increasing warning and decision time for leaders. The alternative is to perpetuate a situation in which mistrust, fear, and shortened leadership decision times characterize a volatile standoff between a nuclear-armed state and a nuclear-armed alliance. Some conclusions. I would like to say that the problems that led to a crisis in the European Union-Russia and NATO-Russia relations reflect the far-reaching differences in politics, culture, and psychology in understanding what significance is attributed to values in determining strategic goals and implementation of them. Thus, the solutions should aim to confirm the binding character of the current political and legal principles and commitments. The new rules have to be worked out in the areas and on the issues that is necessary. The next OSCE summit in 2015, on the 40th anniversary of signing the Helsinki Final Act, may be a proper momentum and opportunity to agree on the mandate and to work out a new comprehensive document similar to the Paris Charter for a New Europe in 1990. In the second decade of the 21st century, the major threats for the international security are of non-conventional nature. They appear mainly within the states, within the nations, and not between them. The source of these threats lies in non-democratic governance and in trampling on universal values. Non-conventional challenges require adequate and non-conventional political and military strategies. The time has come to counteract new threats in an active and creative way instead of passive and reactive manner. Democratic Western states should determine objectives and means of shaping the new political order on the regional and global scale. These principles and rules pertain up to now to relations between the states, and however, as after the end of the Cold War, conflicts and crises are born within nations and not between them, preventing and resolving critical situations should also be internal and domestic. It is addressed both to small and medium-sized countries, as well as the global powers. Even though we know that conflicts are born within countries, we keep looking for solutions within the framework of the international relations. And this is a new challenge for us all. This challenge is not only political, but also an intellectual one. Politicians have the right to expect answers and recommendations from the thinkers, scholars, and independent intellectuals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Minister Rotfeld, thank you so much for those very important comments. Some of those ideas on a new declaration on the 40th anniversary of the OSCE, I think is one we want to capture and hope to continue the discussion. What I'd like to do is welcome our first panel to please come forward. As you'll note from our agenda, we are tireless work masters here at CSIS. There are no breaks. However, please feel free, just be careful, the doors are a little noisy. Go out and refresh your coffee as we go, but we're not going to stop this important conversation for a break. So just wanted to warn you on that, but please help yourself throughout the conversation. Dr. Debski, over to you.
Thank you very much. Professor Rotfeld told us that there is a time to think about, in strategic terms, about our reaction to what had happened between Russia and Ukraine in recent months. So this panel is going to contribute to this strategic thinking. We have managed to invite to this panel the best and the brightest, people who have been working on Russia and policy towards Russia for many, many years. So let me welcome and introduce to you Angela Sten from this city, Marie Mendra from Paris, James Sher from London, and Sergei Utkin from Moscow. So I would like to all the members of the panel to provide some answer why Budapest Memorandum was swallowed by Putin. What had happened? What motivates Russia's foreign policy? So that will be the first part of our discussion. The second, how we should come out of it. What kind of thinking we should propose both to the Western leaders and to Russia to put our world into order. So without further delay, I would like to leave these two questions to James Sher first for his take on this. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, but may I first congratulate CSIS for organizing this conference, and particularly for this stunning new headquarters, which makes me feel that for good or ill, I shall be seeing rather more of the Beacon Hotel in future. Slavik, you asked why. I want to say that what I believe we are witnessing is between ourselves and Russia is not just the breakdown of common interests, but the collapse of a common perception of political reality. However brazen and frequent the misstatements and falsehoods that emanate from the Kremlin, they should not distract us from understanding the magnitude of the problem. And the magnitude of the problem is fundamentally defined by the fact that the Kremlin's cognitive world is now very different from our own. When we do understand that, I would suggest we will be obliged to conclude that the events in Ukraine are not a crisis, but the pivot in a complex and multifaceted struggle over the future of the political and security order of Europe and possibly beyond Europe. In this long-term struggle, there will certainly be oases, there will be periods of armistice, There will be those who are able to negotiate temporary and rewarding immunities for themselves. But I think this is a framework we need to accustom ourselves to for the long term. So what is this cognitive framework that I am referring to? I think there are 4 components of it, which I will endeavor to describe. I will give each of them 2 minutes of attention, if I'm disciplined enough. The first predates any of this. It stems from the internal regime change which Vladimir Putin and his closest associates engineered from Putin's return to the presidency in 2012. This is only partially based on the Bolotnaya factor, the emergence of a clear middle-class educated opposition movement in Russia. But to a greater extent, I believe it reflects the correct realization that the current system had reached the plateau of its economic development and modernization under the present patrimonial model. And everyone who understood this realized, in principle, there is a choice between moving in the direction of an open and competitive economy or moving in the direction of a mobilizational system, narrowing the circle of power and changing the basis of support. I would submit that for the Kremlin, this was not a choice at all. The second element, a constituent of this framework we're looking at, in my view, is a belief in the inevitability of confrontation with the United States. This is not in any way based on a misreading of the policies of President Obama, his intentions, his outlook, or his temperament. It is based on a deep-seated conviction about the underlying strength and permanence, not to say hostility, of the defense and security establishment of the United States, an establishment which is institutionally, and as the Russians like to say, genetically, biased towards the maintenance and expansion of hegemony, intervention in the affairs of other sovereign states, regime change from which Russia is not only not immune, but in many ways a final and most important target. And there is, on top of this, a well-reasoned certainty that is possibly shared by many in this room, that whoever wins the presidential election in 2016, the next US administration will be much tougher and harder in its policy towards Russia than the present administration has been. The third factor is a belief that Europe's resource poverty and underlying objective interests will sooner or later restore sanity and a policy of accommodation to Russian interests in East Central Europe, Eurasia, and of course the former Soviet neighborhood. There is a certainty that the key players in the EU will sooner or later reassert their mastery over European institutions, primarily the European Commission, and over the smaller countries who Dmitry Rogozin a few years ago called Europe's new sickly democracies. This reflects a very profound misreading of Angela Merkel, but that is a subject for another day. Needless to say, though, the underlying premise here is that business interests take precedence over, indeed define, the European interest. And it also is based on an assumption that in the kind of struggle that has emerged now over sanctions, the weak power is not the power with the most to lose, it's the party that is most afraid of losses. And that surely is not Russia, because this leadership understands where there is a key interest, where the stakes are high, the risks must rise accordingly, and so must the costs and the pain you are prepared to accept. The Russian reading of Europe's pain threshold is very low, and that they might not be mistaken in this. So for the Russians, the key question about sanctions for the Kremlin, it's not whether they are level 1, level 2, level 3, or even level 6. It's not how severe they are, but how long they will last. And every hint, every indication that we don't like these sanctions, that they are hurting us, that we would like to diminish them, we would like to find a time where we could get rid of them, simply fortifies their belief that being tough pays and they can manage this unpleasant period. And the last factor is not only a fundamental and systematic misreading of Ukraine, and really the restoration of a Tsarist view about who the Ukrainians are, meaning people who are not a genuine people, but something which goes beyond that, and which was presented very clearly in Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly on the 18th of March. It is the conscious elevation of ethnicity and language over the traditional prerogatives of statehood, the obligations of citizenship, and of course, the sanctity of borders. And this is Vladimir Putin, not simply then, it goes back to a lot of writings that emerged since the last Orange Revolution, the Orange Revolution of 2004. This is a view which has implications for most other countries in Russia's neighborhood. So finally, in conclusion, I would suggest that we are looking at, the Kremlin has a very different view of the balance of strengths and weaknesses that confront it. They do not underestimate the power of many of those with whom they are locked in confrontation. They understand the economic realities perfectly well, but on the other hand, they believe that there are wider global trends that favor Russia, and they believe that the moral factor favors them profoundly. In 2007, I had the temerity to say that Russia had become a proud, resentful, apprehensive, and ambitious power. Today, all of that is true, only more so. It's a dangerous combination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. I think that the main message from your initial statement is... Okay, the main statement of James is that we are not going to deal with a storm. It is not a storm which will go somewhere else in 15 minutes. It's a fundamental climate change. And it will stay with us for a while. And that's why it's fundamentally important to answer the question how we should behave, what kind of equipment we should think about to stay in one piece during this storm. So the floor goes to Anja Stent.
Thank you very much. And even though we didn't coordinate our talks, I think what I'm going to say is going to dovetail very nicely with what you said. And in answer to your question about why the Kremlin ate the Budapest Memorandum, I'm going to talk really about what the world looks like from the Kremlin, because I think we need to understand that as we go forward. We are living in a world now where if you look and if you read what Russian officials write, if you listen to what they say, we're in a world of parallel realities and there are no incontrovertible facts. Or what my colleague Timothy Snyder has called, this is the postmodern Russian view of the world, where nothing is agreed upon, and where we can, even the slightest fact, we can disagree about it. And we heard that from Dmitry Kiselyov, the head of the new Russia Today organization, again this week, saying there's no such thing as facts, we just have different interpretations of them. So what does the world look like from the Kremlin, and how does Vladimir Putin in particular see the world? And my first point is to echo what James said. This is very much a traditional, I would say, Soviet dialectical view of the world. That is to say, it's us, Russia, against the rest of the world, that the West is out to destroy it, and again, we heard that certainly in Putin's speech, and that real accommodation is not possible, and I believe that is how he sees it. And I think there's 6 central maxims that inform Putin's approach to the world. The first one is the obvious one: Russia must have a seat at the table on all important international decisions, and it will constantly insist that its interests and its interpretation of facts are as legitimate, if not more so, than that of the United States, Europe, and other countries. Second, Russia has a right to a sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space, and it will continue to do everything it can using economic attraction and coercion, soft and hard political power, and military force, obviously, as we see in Ukraine, to ensure that Euro-Atlantic structures do not move any closer to Russia's borders. Third, Russia represents an alternative to the decadent Euro-Atlantic civilization that we have heard Mr. Putin and other officials describe. And this appeal to sort of conservative traditional values resonates domestically in Russia, and it resonates internationally among a sort of heterogeneous group of countries. It's an appeal to Muslim countries. It's an appeal to right-wing European political parties that support all of this, this idea that Russia represents traditional values against the decadent West. And so Russia depicts itself as a bastion of forces that oppose revolution, chaos, and liberal ideas. And this we hear more and more from the Kremlin. Fourth, the only true sovereign states, as Mr. Putin has repeatedly said, are those that are not entangled in alliances. And in fact, in a recent speech to discussion with the Security Council, Mr. Putin said, any nation that's part of an alliance gives up part of its sovereignty. So Russia's aim is to go it alone as an independent center of power, seeking neither friends nor allies, but partners like China, and we've seen that very much on display this week in Beijing, a partner with whom it can form coalitions to check American power and resist what it views as Washington's commitment to regime change around the world. Fifth, Vladimir Putin feels that his warnings to the United States and its allies about the dangers and enormous challenges of using military force to promote regime change in Iraq, Libya, Syria were consistently and disastrously ignored. And we heard him at Valdai say that the United States is responsible for the creation of the Islamic State as well as the support for neo-Nazis. But focus again on the U.S. completely misunderstanding the nature of a terrorist threat. And a sixth, and the newest element, I would say, of Putin's worldview has been his explicit commitment to the idea that a Russian world, a Ruski mir, exists, and James already referred to it. One that transcends Russia's state borders. I agree with you completely. So states are kind of relatively less important anymore. And that Russian civilization differs from Western civilization. And so you've heard since the annexation of Crimea, the concept of a divided people, of protecting compatriots abroad. And the central argument is that since the Soviet collapse, there is a mismatch between Russia's state borders and its national or ethnic borders, and that this is both a historical injustice and a threat to Russia's security. And we have also seen, and again this was alluded to, the recurrent, if you like, Tsarist phenomenon that in Russian history, we know, Russia has shrunk and expanded. And unlike other empires that have collapsed, both overseas empires or territorially contiguous empires, Russia has clearly not accepted the fact of this loss of empire. We can quote Catherine the Great again, I have no way to defend my borders but to expand them. And I think we see this phenomenon once again, that Russia's security, its stability is inextricably connected with its ability to dominate its neighbors, and without that, it faces insecurity and it faces disintegration and all of these things that we've heard in Putin's speeches. So, The Kremlin under Vladimir Putin is definitely trying to reassert itself and is reasserting itself as a great power in the world. I do believe that it believes it's at war with the West. It's not just Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, as James said, is the most difficult crisis now, but it's part of a broader problem that we have in this kind of war with the West. And so you see Russia trying to reassert itself as a great global power, one, by dominating its neighborhood. Secondly, I would say by forging these alliances with China and the other BRIC countries, and particularly the alliance with China to try and thwart some of the things that the West is trying to do. And then thirdly, we see Russia, interestingly now, reaching out to areas where the Soviet Union was, had some influence, but then withdrew, and that's Africa, it's different countries in the Middle East, and now increasingly Latin America, as we hear that Russia is contemplating reestablishing naval bases in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So this is kind of reestablishing Russia's global reach. The problem is, with all of this, these are great ambitions, obviously, but they could really only be realized if Russia were able and willing to modernize its economy and to modernize its society and enable it to function as a great power in this world. And so I come in my final remarks to the fact that Russia cannot achieve all of these global ambitions if it doesn't modernize. It faces a number of serious challenges of which we're all aware. Capital flight, which is getting worse and worse, certainly with the sanctions. Brain drain, which again is growing worse in the last year. A deteriorating demographic situation. Again, don't forget that the most shocking statistic being male mortality for young men between 18 and 30, those rates being similar to those in Haiti. Crumbling infrastructure, a continuing low-level insurgency in the North Caucasus. This is not a recipe for a global power that is on the rise and that is going to be able to redesign the world order, about which we heard quite a lot at this Valdai meeting. So I want to close. I know that you want us to get to the question of what do we do about this. And I have to say that the message that James and I were both there in Sochi heard from all of these officials, certainly, at those meetings, were that President Putin was going to be in power for at least another 10 years, which of course he's constitutionally able to do, that they were fully united behind him. We had his deputy chief of staff who was quoted in the Russian newspapers saying, "Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin, and without Putin there is no Russia." So that was certainly the message. So how do you then how do you deal with this situation where we have absolutely no idea what the kind of mechanism eventually for succession is in Russia? So that certainly injects an element of great unpredictability here. I think that in where we are now, and I agree with Professor Rotfeld that obviously we do have to still find ways to try and talk to Russia about the situation. But where we are now, I think that the challenge for the Western countries is that for Europe and the United States is clearly to have as effective deterrence as we can, and that's a challenge given everything that's happening now. Containment of Russia in its neighborhood, clearly, not global containment, but containment of Russia in its neighborhood. And finally, to come back again to what Professor Rotfeld said, the most important thing really is for the United States and its allies, for the transatlantic alliance to strengthen itself, to have unity of purpose, and to understand that we have to face this Russian challenge together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. One important thought out of your contribution. The confrontation with the West seems to be a source of additional legitimization of Putin's regime, and we have to understand that. So we didn't arrive to the present situation to do this climate change by chance. It was done deliberately as a kind of, as I said, additional sort of legitimization. So we have to bear in mind when we think about response, about approach, about looking for the way out from this situation. So the same question goes to Marie Mandra. Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Slavomir. Slavomir really wanted us to answer the question, why is Vladimir Putin acting the way he is? And I would answer that, well, the answer is in the question. Angela has discussed Russia's foreign policy, Russia's interest. When we look at the internal situation of Russia, we no longer talk of Russia's domestic policy, or we talk of Putin's system of rule, and, you know, whether his society, his elites, his military can bear the situation, can continue to deliver what is expected of them. So I would say that it's easy to talk of the Russian state in foreign affairs or even European security. Question who actually makes decision, we are not quite sure. But when I think of Vladimir Putin, and I guess it's probably the same for you, I have a few, you know, adjectives that come to mind. The first is that he is aging. It is an aging person who wants to remain the master of an aging system. And I understand what James is saying, new model in 2012. But I really just see the aggravation of a rather classic, authoritarian, corrupt, and worried leadership. Because we don't have time here now, but I hope in another panel, if you look at the 12 months from November a year ago, Maidan, it is easy to demonstrate that Putin did not have a grand design, that his advisors didn't have a grand design, and that they have, like us, be taken by surprise at, you know, many, many steps. And that probably, if Putin could have consolidated his sphere of privileged interest without paying such a high cost, militarily, politically, diplomatically, he would be much happier. So I would like to, you know, look at the situation in Russia today, not only as, you know, what Putin, the master, can achieve in conditions that we all know perfectly well, with extreme repression, and so what Putin can actually may seem to be just what he wants. And what I'd like to say is that that's probably not the case. I think that there are some limits to what the man and his inner circle can decide and implement. It is a system of rule that is failing inside. I mean, there are no other words. It is failing inside. See if Sergei contradicts me. But it is failing. I mean, if you remember, as early as the beginning of 2012, good Russian and foreign economists were already writing about a severe slowdown, and the recession, zero growth, came earlier than expected. What it shows is that a country, and I think both James and Angela showed how isolated. I mean, if you have only partners and others have, you know, allies and excellent economic and security friend, that it is a form of isolation. Alone in an isolated country, if it should has recreated some of the conditions of the besieged fortress. That is, that people cannot really leave, and people cannot really protest, people cannot, really vote, and accept that they have no personal or collective perspective. Is this the case? Is about disinformation. Why does the regime need to go that far in disinformation and lies? It is so enormous at times that you wonder, why do they need to go that far? I think there are two aims in disinformation. One is to society and inside the elites so that they will stay quiet. And the bigger the lie, the more difficult it is in a non-democratic society to establish the truth. But there is a drawback, which, again, I think, the Ukrainian developments have aptly demonstrated, is that the leadership actual situation was in Ukraine, they might have acted differently. The second aim of full disinformation is transgression. The ultimate power in an aging and failing system is for the leader to be the one who can transgress at any time. When he decided to free and expel Mikhail Khodorkovsky in December 2013, it was a liberation by transgression. Because, how can you free a Russian citizen and just tell him he can no longer live in his own country without any legal It seems to me that it starts to backfire inside Russia and also in the relationship with us, the Western governments. With us, I think it's just, very simple. We have good tools of analysis. For a long time, during about 20 years after the beginning of Gorbachev's reform, it was very easy to travel there, to study there, to work there. So we do know Russia, and we have fantastic tools. We don't make that many mistakes in studying the situation today and the trends. The Russian economy can be back to reasonable growth with the amount of oil and gas that they're selling in 3 or 4 years. So we have the tools. I think between us, we know why the Kremlin is doing what it is doing. Survival, consolidation, and there is making many friends around. So if we have those tools, and we still have excellent colleagues in Russia, thank you, Sergei, we can certainly propose analysis and solutions. Now, the question of society and the elites. or what they are told in Putin's speeches, are they really hyper-nationalists? Are they all overwhelmed by those emotions of grandeur? And are they willing to continue and fight against the Ukrainians, fight at their borders? This is where it becomes with full disinformation. We can no longer rely on public opinion polls as telling us something really reliable about what people actually think and understand. They are asked in a situation system. You have Putin. He has not, he's not that efficient, but you don't know what comes after. If we compare some of the opinion polls with other data that we have, we see a much more distrustful society, very worried were contested in the streets and on the internet and in the ballot box. People then, many in Russia, believed that there would be a Russia after Putin. So I think this was there 2-3 years ago, and in a way it is still, there. Many of them no longer live in Russia. So we have to rely on a sample that may not be that representative. But what we know from economic data, falling investment in Russia, Russian and foreign investment in Russia, and other So to conclude, I would say that it's not for us to build a model in which, because Putin is still the master and can go very far in the use And I believe that it is up to us, because we know the country, we do not live there, to take the liberty to prolong the trends and to start anticipating how the when fear is no longer so heavy on everybody, people can change their mind in a minute and then forget about Putin and the legacy. So I would say if it comes to our attitude, we're back to square one. Build an alternative network of contacts, because there will be one day when simply the men will no longer be there.
Thank you very much, Marie, for your take. The logic of political survival governs Putin's behavior, with all its consequences for foreign policy and also for its domestic policy. Putin managed to change the climate not only outside of Russia, but also inside of Russia. And Marie is telling us that this new climate inside of Russia may significantly influence the chances of political survival of Putin's regime. So now the floor goes to Sergei. How do you see it? How do you read all this climate change from a Russian point of view?
Thank you, Slawomir. Thank you for inviting me. First, I would say that the climate has changed indeed, both internationally and in Russia. And you do have consequences that will not vanish in several months or a year or two. So it's a significant change that will play a role in our relations between Russia and the West for years. How this happened, why this happened, is it supported by the Russian people? Well, I'll try to give my opinion on that. I am absolutely sure that there can be different points of view, and eventually, if we speak about the events in Ukraine, I just have to underline that on the one hand, personally, I think that the policies that were taken by the Russian government were wrong and eventually detrimental for Russia itself. But they were agreed, they were implemented, and now we cannot imagine a world as if the things that have happened did not happen. We will have to look for solutions in this new situation when you cannot restore the broken glasses and cannot return to life the people who died because of the conflict that we still have in Ukraine. Speaking about the necessity for these policies of Putin, I think that what he has chosen was not really inevitable or necessary for the survival of his regime, as people sometimes say. He could well survive, and his regime could survive by just staying neutral on developments in Ukraine and leaving the Maidan to its own fates, and this would not be a problem for Russia's internal developments. But the president of Russia has his own convictions. Some of them were named already. And indeed, I mean, you should not think that when he speaks openly to the public, be it in his Crimea speech or in his Valdai or Sochi speech recently, which is compared by many to Munich speech, you should not think that this is just a smokescreen to hide his willingness to earn money or keep the power for any cost. I think that he's really believing in the things he says. He is serious about geopolitics. He thinks that geopolitical interests are among the vital interests of his country. And that means that he may not dilute his policies, in his view, to the economic growth and stay away of any conflicts and processes that exist in the neighboring countries. For him, this is just another vital interest of Russia to be present there, as he hinted in his last speech in the Valdai, in Sochi, at the gathering on the Valdai Club. He sees these post-Soviet space as his forest, where you should not go too far irritating the bear. In the same time, if we speak about understanding, I think that in the West you have not that much problem understanding what's happening in Russia, as some people say. And I think our panel perfectly shows that you have experts who follow the events, who try to understand the country, and they made a lot of points I can agree with. And if you don't find an answer to certain questions, this often means that answer simply doesn't exist. I mean that those questions that you pose to yourself, like what is the support for Putin's regime, what people in Russia think about Russia's actual foreign policy, why do those who support those policies do that? These are the questions you may find in Russian newspapers today. I just read yesterday a couple of articles that are written by Russian intellectuals, and they are asking themselves the same questions. They don't find a clear answer, and they are also struggling to see what can be the next steps of the Russian government, what can happen to the country in the future. So this is not something that sort of distinguishes the Western academic debate from Russian academic debate. Everywhere you have people who are perplexed by what's happening, and they did not really, be it in Russia or in the West, even with all the quality of their expertise, they did not see the Ukrainian policies as we saw them, Russian-Ukrainian policies, coming. If asked before the crisis, they would all say that this is simply impossible. But still, if we take these policies and try to analyze them, I think it's important to understand that this is not the end game of Russian development. This is not the last point in that. Some people speak about the Ukrainian crisis as if it's a crisis that revealed the real face of Russia. I think that this is not the case. We are at a certain point of development of our country, and if we speak about Europe in general, if we speak about other countries, you can find a lot of examples how countries of Europe with definitely a background of European tradition, European literature and culture, they were at certain points going the way of authoritarian development. They were going the way of expansionism. So it's not about being European or anti-European, Western or anti-Western. It's about a stage of development that we have currently. And this stage that we are now witnessing is not a difficult one just for other countries that try to define their relations with Russia. It's also very difficult for Russia, and this concerns both the events today, because I think that what's happening in Ukraine is a catastrophe not just for Ukraine but for Russia. And it even more concerns the consequences, because the consequences we see today are just the very beginning of what can come next. And I'm not speaking about the sanctions. Indeed, the most visible problems in the Russian economy, they are not the result of sanctions. They are a result of Russian internal economic dynamics, the impossibility to find engines of growth, and the consequences of the Ukrainian policies themselves, including the necessity to integrate Crimea in the Russian Federation. You can imagine that this is also not coming for free. In the same time, when we concentrate too much on the Ukrainian crisis. I think we should not forget that even if the Russian state TV speaks that much about Ukraine, the country is still huge and very diverse. You have people in most of the regions preoccupied, first and foremost, with their level of life, with their opportunities in business, in what they actually do, how they can spend their vacations. And this means for the majority, Ukraine and what happens around it still remains a picture on the TV screen. And if something goes bad, goes in unfortunate direction in their real lives, and I mean economic development, they will not be able to ignore it just because bright and shining pictures are shown on the TV screen on Russian foreign policy achievements. I think that in the next several years we will see how the economic problems and the lack of economic growth mentioned by Marie will determine to an ever larger extent the level of support of Putin by the population. This cannot be covered by what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening with Crimea. You will, in any case, go to the shops. You will see the prices. You will see the rate of ruble. And these will be, in most cases, not really pleasant experiences. The thing is that we can be in this phase of decline, economic decline, for quite some years. My feeling is that this may last for 10 years, for about 10 years. So up until the presidential elections in 2024, we may have the current government struggling to mitigate the consequences of economic troubles and still being able to survive. This is just a guess how it might happen. But I agree with what has been said already, that we should think about the fact that this economic decline and these policies cannot last forever. At some point, you will have to see a serious political change. And what comes at this point, at the point of political change? We had one of the Russian film directors trying to launch a series for TV, for Russian independent channel Dozhd, a series which has never been really shot. There was just one pilot episode of this series, and the name of the series is Завтра, which is tomorrow. The idea of the series was that, well, around 2018, at the next presidential elections, somehow, this is not described in the film, what are the circumstances, somehow you have the present Russian government living and the opposition taking the power. So the people from the opposition, they get to the Kremlin, they get to the presidential administration, to the empty cabinets, and they have to rule the country. And this happens to be difficult because, as you understand, if these are people who had completely no experience in the government before, well, even in established democracies, like in France, we currently have a Hollande government, which is blamed by some for being not experienced enough because socialists were not in the government for years before that. In the case of Russia, and if you speak about the opposition really coming to power, you really will have people who will have difficult time struggling with very basic challenges of establishing the governability of the country. And this is one of the risks. If we speak about possible political change, we should make sure that it goes relatively smooth, that it does not destroy the country, that the new government, possible government that comes in the future, they are professionals and they are integrated in the international political debate, that they think about their country as not an isolated island, but as about part of international community. And for this, I think the most important thing that we have to ensure now in the course of the Ukrainian crisis is even if you are furious about the Putin's policies, even if you don't like them, it's important not to help the isolation of Russia. In many cases, this isolation is actually led and determined by the acts of the Russian government. But if this policy of isolation, self-isolation, is successful, this will not be just a problem for the Russian people. It will be a problem for the international community. That's why I think it's important to put all efforts in establishing those contacts on various levels that Marie has mentioned, kind of more networking on with non-governmental organizations, with the business, working with the Russian businessmen in those cases where it is still possible, more peer-to-peer contacts on the personal basis. This is important to have for long term. I mean, not in the next year or two, but for the next decade. Not to get Russia in 10 years closer to the patterns of Iran, but to get it closer probably to the patterns of Spain in the last years of Franco. You can remember that countries like Spain, Spain, Portugal, you can continue with this list, were quite isolated, and they were the governments were not considered to be part of the West, and they themselves tried to underline that they're different. In case of Spain, they were saying about being the last beacon of Catholicism. So this is something that happens to regimes of this kind, but. When it comes to the population, the Spanish population, the Portuguese population, they were not that much isolated. In the business world, they were not that much isolated. And by the way, well, under different political circumstances in the atmosphere of the Cold War, the US actually did a lot to help Spain not to remain in complete isolation. I don't think this is the US that will play the same role for Russia these days. It can rather go about the European countries, the EU, that still keeps about 50% of trade turnover in the overall Russian trade. But this is important to do. This is important to ensure that people from Russia, those 140 million people, they have opportunities to communicate with the West, to work with the West, and eventually understand the West better. Because at this point, about 80% of the population, they don't travel, they don't meet Westerners in their life, because there is no particular occasion, they don't learn foreign languages. And this means there is a huge job to be done in terms of integrating the country in the global world, not the government, but the country. And I think if this is successful, you will have the Russian people supporting different kind of policies, not tomorrow, but in 10 years' time.
Thank you, Sergei, for excellent contribution. It seems that there is no tomorrow in Russia. Putin wants today to last forever, one may say. And a very important message from Sergei: we should not isolate Russians. We should try to communicate to the authorities and to the society that we are not going to accept the climate change by Putin, that we are not going to accept new rules of the game. And to do so, we have to communicate with them on all flows, on all grounds possible. Now I would like to open the floor for some interventions. I have two individuals, 3, 4, probably will have no more time to do so, but first, Vladimir Ohrysko, the former foreign minister of Ukraine. I would like all of speakers to introduce themselves and tell us about their affiliations and be as comprehensive as only possible.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. I'm awfully sorry to take the floor for the second time, taking down my yesterday's speech. So I will be very short in my remarks. First, I would like to thank all panelists for really brilliant contributions to our discussion. And secondly, ask for clarity in formulations, because some of you used the wordings crisis in Ukraine. Dear friends, there is no crisis in Ukraine. There is a Russian aggression against Ukraine. So let us be correct in our wordings. And my question goes to Dr. Utkin. You said that Russia will have probably 10 years some perspectives. And Marie, in her remarks, explained the really very special situation within Russia, I mean the civil society. How can you explain that more than 84% of Russians now are supporting Putin's policy? Thank you.
Excellent. Next.
Thank you. My name is Hall Gardner. I'm a professor and chair at the American University of Paris. I've been writing on NATO-Russian relations for the past 20 years. My point is, first point, is that I think we have to distinguish between the Putin that wants NATO in Afghanistan and the Putin that doesn't want NATO in Sevastopol. In other words, to find elements where Putin, we can work together with Putin, and as long as he is in power. And secondly, to look for the elements such as Syria. I really think we can't resolve the ISIS crisis without Russian backing and support. That's one area. Looking at the Crimea area, I think the costs of going into Crimea are substantially high, and therefore we have an opening there to show that we can ease the Russians out of this crisis if we keep the doors open to communication. Therefore, I totally support, we can't isolate Russia. I think that's going to be a more dangerous situation than it is already. Thank you.
Sir.
Michael Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Was the Putin speech or comments about the Nazi-Soviet pact more of the same, or was it, as Timothy Snyder wrote in the New York Review of Books a couple of days ago, a really significant intellectual and political breakpoint?
Stephen Cantor, formerly with the U.S. Council for International Business, and picking up on the point was made, Russia being an alternative to Euro decadence. Well, maybe they really need some Euro decadence again. So I guess my question is, what's the carrot? What's the carrot to get them back to the table economically, to turn the economy around? And I'm wondering, if in 2 or 3 or 5 years the US and the EU do conclude this trade agreement, the then Secretary of State would have one of these open thoughts, not a proposal saying, gee, I wonder if Russia could become an associate member of this US-EU trade agreement. How would that affect things internally in the Russian thinking?
And last intervention from these two gentlemen.
My name is Valery Kovalevsky, Belarus Politics blog. There's a famous joke born in Russia. The West tried to bring Russia on its knees, but Russia preferred to lie on the ground. My question is to Sergei Utkin. While we are discussing what Russia thinks, what Russia is like these days, what Russians do to understand West, what Russia does to understand interests of the neighboring countries, what they like, what they don't like, what is being done on this? Is there anything at all done on this? Thank you.
John Kunstadter, Radzimba Photo. This is also directed at Mr. Utkin. We've heard about how Russia sees itself as a moral beacon against Western decadence. 3 days ago, Kirill at an assembly in Moscow made a speech in which he, as patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, did not mention God, Christ, or our Savior once. And he has just defined what it means to be a Russian in a way that excludes at least 25% of the population of the Russian entity. Would you please make a prediction? You've spoken about maybe in 10 years seeing a change. Do you think that it will take 10 years or longer for the cathedrals of Our Lady of Kazan in Moscow and Petersburg to be converted into mosques, and for the nations of Ural to gain their independence? Thank you.
Okay. So in order to give Sergei more time to prepare, I will start from James. Would you like to comment, answer some questions?
In a necessarily simplified manner, given the time constraints. One level, the answer to the Nazi-Soviet question is a flat no. I remember an earlier Valdai lunch when Putin basically shrugged his shoulders at the mention of the question and said, we were the last people to conclude a non-aggression pact with Germany, so there's no case for us to answer. But the question, obviously, is why did he say this now? And I think it is part of a wider diplomatic and informational policy designed to make Russia's neighbors extremely nervous. And when you view it in the context of several high-level statements to the effect that the Baltic states should look at what has been happening in Ukraine and draw conclusions about how we expect Russians to be treated, then it all starts to fit together. On regard to one of the other points that was made, I can only state a contrary thesis, which is a subject for discussion. My view is that those who are currently in power will only reassess this policy when it becomes clear to those power structures and a slightly broader set of power structures in Russia that the current policy is profoundly damaging Russia's underlying interests. And until that happens, I do not think they will change. And any alluring and attractive carrots and invitations will simply be seen as vindication that the present course is the correct one.
Angela.
Thank you. I will just take up 2 points. Michael, on your question about the Nazi-Soviet pact. I mean, it really struck me. I remember in the sort of Gorbachev era having discussions, public discussions here at different think tanks, et cetera, in Washington, where the line mainly was, even at that point, that the reason why the Soviet Union signed the pact with the Nazis is because they were driven to it, because the British, the other Western countries didn't, want to talk to them. They sent the slow boat there. And in fact, the message then was, if you don't think about what you're doing more seriously, then we're going to ally with China. And this is now in the Gorbachev period. So I agree with James that to have Putin say, why last week? That in fact this was a rather efficient policy, and that's what people did at the time. They got together and they divided up countries, and again, the message being, that people shouldn't feel that any of these borders are necessarily secure, and it comes back to your delightful short video. If you can eat the Budapest Memorandum, why should any of these borders, be secure? And I have to say that, again, at this Valdai meeting, and this was a discussion not with Putin, with another official, the question of the future of Moldova and what was going to happen there came up, and we were told that, we should watch out because something, unforeseen or unfortunate might happen there. And then the second point is on the question of cooperating on Syria. Of course, if you look at it objectively, you could say we do have the same interest, that we don't want Islamic extremists to take over this part of the world for all the reasons that we know. The problem is we have a very different attitude towards what should happen to President Assad than the Russians do. Obviously, the Russians believe that you need a strong secular leader in Syria, and that this is the person to have there. We've heard just again today from our own administration that in order to conquer ISIS, Islamic State, we're going to have to do something about Assad. And then again, coming back to what we heard a couple of weeks ago, 4,000 feet above Sochi, is we were told, well, we have a rather different definition of what terrorists are, which of course is true. And we could, again, we don't have time to discuss that. And therefore, any real cooperation, counter-terrorist cooperation or cooperation vis-a-vis Islamic State, we'd have to come back and really sit down and talk about, how do we move forward with a common understanding of what terrorism is.
Excellent. Marie.
Thank you. I think in this context, Mikhail Gorbachev's support for Putin is sad. It's making things even more difficult for us and for the enlightened elites in Russia. And the question about public opinion polls, I said very briefly that although I have been using them for a long time, that in the last year or so, I no longer use them as, 84% of the Russian population supports Putin or likes Putin or agrees with Putin. This is not what it means. I would need a little more time to explain. But first, the questions are asked only about Putin, and Putin today is Russia, as I think all of us here agree. And maybe he's even God, if so. When you look at the other questions and answers, the majority of Russians do not trust the government, do not trust the administration, are as angry as before about corruption, and understand very well that corruption goes all the way up to the top of the state. So it seems to me that it is very much in this emotional context of trying to replace the Ukrainian aggression. I think you're very right. I think it is a Russian aggression in Ukraine, to try and impose those images of war scare. That is, Russia maybe is not quite at war, but could be at war, so that people do not feel free to think differently about whether they might do without Putin or not. And in opinion polls, if there's only one man who is more and more alone in ruling the country, and there is no alternative, it is difficult for an ordinary Russian to answer if he cannot even think of an alternative to Putin.
Sergei.
First, on the terminology mentioned by Mr. Agryska on the crisis in Ukraine. I have heard already quite a number of the same complaints on the part of Ukrainians. I think it's about it's about how we understand the meaning of the word's crisis in Ukraine. In my understanding, if I speak about the crisis in Ukraine, I do not mean at all that it is Ukraine which is guilty of the events there, and you don't have to blame it on Russia or other countries. You may have lots of reasons for a crisis, but I think what is happening and what has happened already during the year is justifiably called Ukrainian crisis, because you had so many events happening, many of them not related to Russian military activities. You had a revolution, you had economic instability, which is still continuing. Still, the country is on the brink of economic breakdown and would need a lot of international support, and I hope it gets it. So it's a much broader picture, and in the end of the day, if you put it like an opposition of the word crisis and the word war, when we had the First World War, in some publications it was called major European crisis, and there is nothing wrong with that. So it's just a matter of how we understand this, and I by no means try to reduce the importance of Russian policies in this context. On the support of the population, I agree with Marie that we should not take this 84% at face value. Imagine if you are called at your home address and people say, here's an opinion poll service, we would like to know, do you support Vladimir Putin? I mean, there are people who would answer, no, I wouldn't, but there are also those who would have answered, no, I wouldn't, but they actually answer, yes, I do support. This is only one of the explanations, because there are, of course, others. There is an influence of the TV, and the state TV is completely controlled by the government, and the priorities of the government are reflected there. It's not the case in the printing press and on the internet, in spite of a number of cases where you had serious pressure on the part of the government and cases of censorship. Still, you can find all sorts of opinions there, but it's a very minor part of the population which is really influenced by what's written in newspapers or in some analytical reports or even on radio. Most of the people receive their information from TV, and they are satisfied with what they see. And they watch exclusively Russian TV just because a very tiny minority speaks foreign languages and pays attention to what's happening abroad. And this is one more thing which is important, that you may think that if people support, they think that Crimea and the policies on Ukraine are very important for them. I think this is not really the case, and what you actually have is that the majority of people, they don't think much about international relations or foreign policy, just as in most of other countries, including the US. And they think about that in a very simple manner. Troubles happened in Ukraine. And a number of ethnic Russians who live in Crimea, they decided to join us. So what's the problem? Where's the place for the West in this picture? Why are they so irritated? We just saved some ethnic Russians, a couple of millions of ethnic Russians in Crimea. What's the problem? Why should they be against this? So I think that people just underestimate the complexity of international system and underestimate how fragile it is, how the rules are important, and this is probably a task for educators, for educating the people that what is being done is actually wrong. We don't have time, but one minute. On the TTIP, it was not mentioned by other participants. This US-EU free trade area. I think it's important that we pay increasing attention to it. Actually, we do follow this process, and we care about possible results. It was just mentioned along with the Trans-Pacific negotiations by Putin himself in his interview right before the G20 summit. And I can imagine that in line with other tendencies in the Russian government, you will have people who will see this process as something directed against Russia. I don't think under the present political circumstances we can speak about Russia being associated to this process. But at some point in the future, I think it is important for Russia not just to isolate it from the vast areas that will unite Europe and the United States and will unite the countries of the Pacific, but to participate in these spaces, to take part in decision-making. And this actually was one of the reproaches made by many, including those in Putin's administration, against the West, that you are sort of not ready to give Russia decision-making powers, be it in European institutions, be it on the global level. I think we will not resolve this conundrum with Putin still heading the country, but at some point in the future, I can imagine that there will be more possibilities for Russia to take part in decision-making in the framework of this TTIP, for example, in a responsible and cooperative manner.
Thank you very much. I was really honored to chair this excellent panel, and now I want you to thank the panelists. Applause, please.
Now, don't go away. We're going to switch the panel very briefly, and we're going to start up in about 2 more minutes. Thank you. Tremendous. Wonderful. And